So, dear friends, as I mentioned in the beginning of the Holy Eucharist, that today we are celebrating the feast of the presentation of the Lord. And in some countries, for example, in Mexico, Peru, or Argentina, or some European countries like France, Spain, Portugal, and also Italy, the feast of presentation of the Lord is also known as Candlemas or Candelaria. So that's why in the Holy Eucharist, actually, there are two parts that we need to celebrate. First is the procession of the candles, but instead of we skip it, then we continue with the celebration of the Holy Eucharist directly. So the feast of the Candlemas or Candelaria or the presentation of the Lord is very important because in the Holy Eucharist there is a procession of the candles which become the central part of the celebrations. And also at the same time, the feast of the presentation of the Lord is meant to honor the Virgin of Candelaria, that is the Mother of Jesus Christ. So anyhow, going back to the Gospel today, this Sunday as we celebrate the feast of the presentation of the Lord, our Gospel is taken from the account in which the Holy Family, Mary, Jesus, and also Joseph, presenting Jesus in the temple according to the local custom, that is the law of Moses. The Gospel begins with the opening sentence, when the days of the purification according to the law of Moses were fulfilled, Mary and Joseph brought him up to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord. Now, dear friends, we got to pay attention to this particular sentence because here in the Gospel, especially in English, if you compare with Spanish or other language, English translation is a little bit different. It says, when the days of the purification according to the law of Moses were fulfilled, they brought him up to Jerusalem. Well, I give you another example. For instance, in Spanish, it says, en el día de la purificación de María, en el día de la purificación de María, meaning to say, and the day of the purification of Mary. It's completely different here. When the days of the purification according to law of Moses were fulfilled, and then we have a question in English, who fulfilled the purification of the Lord? For sure Mary. But it has something, leave us a gap of a question, who fulfilled the day of the purifications? So that's why, in order to understand this particular sentence, the opening of our gospel today, according to the Jewish traditions back then, purification rites applies only to a mother following the birth of a child. So it means after a mother delivers a baby safely, she is considered unclean for 40 days, if she gives a birth of a son, a boy, or 80 days following the birth of a daughter. So there is a difference here, 40 days and 80 days. So a girl is longer than a man. And then the question is why there is a difference here. So going back to the book of Numbers, if you familiar with the Old Testament in the book of Numbers, you can see there is a reason over there between a male and a female over there. But it is not. It has nothing to do with the difference between gender. It has something to do with the culture, by the way. So, in the local practice of ordinary Jewish people like Mary and Joseph, at this point, based on today's gospel, we can see that this young couple is very pious and devoted people. They observe the religious practices according to the law of Moses. Again, law of Moses in the book of Numbers. The purifications and also the presentation of the Lord. It has something to do with the book of Numbers. In order to understand this particular gospel, we have to connect with this, the Old Testament, especially in the book of Numbers. So there is no doubt that Mary and Joseph from the very beginning are obedient to the law of Moses. It is because the law of Moses was God's plan in the Old Testament for the salvation of the Jewish people. So Mary and Joseph, they embraced the law of Moses. they do understand and they put into practice in their daily life. And this is exactly what they are observing, the presentation of the Lord. But also the purifications. After 40 days, then Mary and Joseph brought Jesus up to Jerusalem to be presented to the Lord. Now, even though the presentation of the Lord in the temple is observed based on the cultural traditions, however, in the context of the salvation of the Lord, this particular event has to be understood not only in the religiosity of those people based on the law of Moses, but also in the frame of God's fulfillment His promise. Meaning to say, I would like to invite you to go beyond what we see today in the gospel. Because, well, in the custom and traditions, yes, they go to Jerusalem in the synagogue, presented Jesus to the Lord, but there is a message behind it that we need to understand also. So the presentation of the Lord in the temple serves as a consecration and redemption of the firstborn. Why the firstborn? We are reminded here in the moment in the Old Testament, especially when God killed the firstborn sons in Egypt. Here we are reminded one of the 10 plagues that God imposed to Pharaoh in order to free his people out of Egypt. We remember there are 10 plagues that God imposed to Pharaoh. God hardened his heart, and one of them killing the firstborn of the son, entire Egypt, including the son of Pharaoh at the time. So therefore, when Mary and Joseph came to the temple and presented Jesus, it signifying that the child is holy to the Lord in one hand, and the other hand, at the same time, this moment commemorates the deliverance of people of Israel through the final plague that all firstborn of Israel, whom God killed in Egypt, are to be redeemed through the presentation of Jesus and Mary. So now we can see that the presentation of the Lord in the gospel today is not only a cultural thing, but also the fulfillment of what God had promised to his people Israel. Okay, I kill you today, but there will be a time I will redeem all the babies that I kill. And exactly today, this is the fulfillment of what God had promised to Israel, that the presentation of the Lord is the fulfillment of what God had promised. Very interesting here today when we see how wonderful God is in the history of salvations. So dear friends, at this point at least we understood that the feast of the presentation of the Lord today has two significant meanings: cultural and religiosity. Both of them refer to the significance and interpretation of tradition within the context of religious beliefs that the broader culture practices of their community. So therefore, the Jewish people on the day of Jesus, just like Mary and Joseph in the gospel today, observe a multitude of ritual observances to mark the significant passages on their ordinary life. So these observances serve as a constant reminder, and one of them is the presentation of the Lord. It is a constant reminder on their relationship with God and encourage them to regard all of life as sacred. And most importantly, the love of the Lord to his people of Israel is real presence in their daily life. So at this point, we can see the importance of the presentation of the Lord. It is not only cultural, but also it is the fulfillment what God had promised, not only when he killed the baby, the firstborn in Egypt, but eventually he fulfilled what he had said through the presentation of the Lord, that all the babies will be saved